And the big deal for environmental assessment is how it will operate in what is now a no analog world. What is the relative relationship to them in terms of significance to either achieve something or to avoid something? Decision makers see those kind of trade-offs made in the political realm.
How can we make environmental impact assessment better? This is the main driving question of a series of online interviews I've been doing with some of the world's leading EIA specialists. Today I have the honor to talk to Barry Sadler about this simple but very challenging question. However, I broke down this question into a set of 5 sub-questions which are today related to the topic of sustainability assessment and trade-off evaluations. Barry Sadler has been involved in EIA since 1969, which means that his 50-year-old career coincides with the history of EIA. Barry has worked for many institutions in Canada, the UK, and other countries. He was, for example, principal advisor to the Canadian Environmental Assessment Research Council, chief executive of the UK Institute for Environmental Management and Assessment, and special advisor to global organizations like UNEP and the World Health Organization. Barry Sadler has also co-authored many articles, reports, and books that are really a must-read for those who are interested in strategic environmental assessment and sustainability assessment. I reached Barry in his house in Victoria, British Columbia. So Barry, you were the main author of what is now a famous report about the effectiveness of environmental impact assessment. I'm talking about the 1996 report, Environmental Assessment in a Changing World. That publication, despite all the problems that were identified in both practice and theory, it had overall a very positive message about the future of EIA. It's been now 25 years since that report came out, and I feel like I have to ask you this question. Are you still optimistic about the future of EIA?
2 thoughts strike me with regard to optimism. Yes, I'm certainly optimistic about environmental assessment and the particular role it can play in terms of improving decision making. I'm far less optimistic about the actual impact it will have within government decision-making, the whole governance structure and the institutional arrangements around it. I think there's one other huge issue that in the 25 years since that report was completed, the environmental framework itself has changed dramatically. We've moved into an epoch that many call the Anthropocene, where the human footstep is so much bigger. We've got the collision of biodiversity loss and climate change, which are presenting a huge issue. And the big deal for environmental assessment is how it will operate in what is now a no analog world. We don't necessarily have the models where predict and never had real certainty, but it certainly had reference points that were, if you will, more discrete than they are now. We're moving in some cases, people claim, earth scientists claim, beyond planetary boundaries. How do you factor that kind of incertitude into an environmental assessment process that ostensibly deals with prediction? That to me is the huge dilemma and the major change. The one other thing I will say is in trying to sort of put together a 25-year reflection, it has really struck me how large and how diverse and sprawling the field has grown compared to 1996. And it was possible then, perhaps perhaps it's conceit in hindsight, but it was possible then to do an evaluation. The field now is so large, so diverse, so sprawling, encompassing all kinds of perspectives on it. It's very difficult to actually try and package that in a way that is both faithful to all that's gone on and at the same time is manageable enough that you can try and draw some sensible considerations and conclusions.
All right. So, Barry, let's talk now about sustainability assessment, which has been considered one of the most promising avenues of impact assessment. After all, what is sustainability assessment and how does it differ from traditional EIA?
Let me respond in 2 ways. Very briefly, it differs substantially and substantively. In terms of the substantial difference, I see a difference, first of all, between sustainability appraisal, which is a whole of public policy review of the considerations and the progress towards sustainable development. And that can include ex post and ex ante studies. Within that, I can see that impact assessment as a formal process is a mainstream policy tool to come to grips with the issues. So I differentiate between sustainability appraisal in the whole of the field sense and sustainability assessment, which is founded more on the, if you will, the EIA foundations that impact assessment professionals would recognize. The big difference, of course, is that sustainability assessment is looking at and trying to integrate environmental, social, and economic considerations of a particular proposal or a proposed course of action. Whereas environmental assessment, in a very traditional sense, has looked only at the environmental dimensions. But of course, in the last 20 years especially, that concept of environment has grown significantly different. So you're looking at, even there, a whole bundle of considerations, including social issues. In this country, certainly you will be looking at indigenous values as well, and many other considerations. There's a strong, if you will, fairness and equity dimension to it now, formalized as environmental justice under NEPA and the US practice. So environment assessment itself has, as if you like, increased significantly in scope, so that it is, if you will, a more integrated approach than it was before. But the full integration across the three pillars of environment, economics, and social aspects of sustainability, I would leave with sustainability assessment. And the big issue there is how you integrate those in terms of coming up to, if you will, a considered set of positions about the trade-offs that are involved, which sort of moves on towards your next question.
Yeah, so let's talk about trade-offs, which are actually one of my favorite topics in impact assessment. As a Brazilian, my first language is Portuguese, and interestingly, we don't have the word trade-off in the Portuguese language, which means that whenever I'm teaching or lecturing about trade-offs in Brazil, I always have a hard time explaining trade-offs. And I'm now hoping that you can help me out here. So my next question is, what are trade-offs and why are they so important to EIA decision-making?
It's a good question. It's the kind of relative judgment you would make regarding the positive and the negative aspects of something. And there's a whole range of things stack up. If, for example, a normal environmental assessment, just to take the environment, if you're looking at doing that from a sustainability assurance point of view, you'll be trying to come to grips with significance. What is the significance of this particular impact? How is that significant relative to other kinds of impacts? And you'll often have a mix of, if you will, the goods and the bads, the positive and the negative. And it's how you package those in terms of the relationship between them, and whether this is, if you will, a positive assessment or a negative one. That's where the trade-offs lie at that level. Many of the trade-offs that we talk about are political trade-offs. And in many cases, they happen, if you will, behind closed doors or under the table or behind the curtain, whatever the particular phrase is. And they're not necessarily clear or explicit. And I think the value of doing an assessment is to try and make clear and as systematic as possible what the dimensions of the trade-offs are between various effects you've identified and their assessed significance. Now, some of those will be relative, and particularly if you're making those against some explicit criteria of sustainability, you're really just trying to make a good faith judgment. They won't be that explicit. And I think in many cases, if you will, comparative or relative risk is a real advantage to try and put it into that kind of comparative risk framework. So you can also identify, within, again, fairly elastic limits, the confidence that you have in making judgments, both about the effects and about their relative significance, and therefore the trade-offs that are implied or made clear.
All right, Barry, I have to ask you a follow-up question related to trade-offs. Why are decision makers still reluctant to transparently evaluate and communicate trade-offs?
They are reluctant about trade-offs, and I think there's a very clear reason for it, that most decision makers see those kind of trade-offs made in the political realm, that they will take a report and then they will judge the trade-offs in terms of whatever framework, their policy framework they're working within. And I think that the role for environmental assessment or sustainability assessment is to try and make those trade-offs as explicit as possible. In other words, the bundles of goods and bads and their relative dimensions and how they stack up should be as clear and precise as an assessor can make it. They may not then label them trade-offs, but de facto, what you're getting is a trade-off framework that you're putting in front of decision makers who normally would be reluctant to let the technical side of the thing. Certainly, they don't want them making those trade-offs. And I think the more explicit that they can be made, whether using the sort of rules-based approach that Bob Gibson promotes, or whether you use the floor-to-ceiling approach that I've tried to promote in terms of triple top lines, triple bottom lines, what's acceptable and what's unacceptable between them, and there's dimensions that you can do to gain that. But that's, I think, the best that assessors can do. I don't necessarily think it's a great idea for assessment itself to take on the burden of making trade-offs, which is to suggest what will actually happen between the balance of goods and bads. I think that's where you make it explicit, kick it upstairs to those who have to make the political decision and wear it.
Barry, moving on to the next question. As you know, we have here in Canada a new Impact Assessment Act, which is requiring proponents to evaluate contributions to sustainability. And now people are asking about the specifics of this process. And that's my final question for you today. How can we design EIA laws and regulations that actually contribute to sustainability?
I think in three ways, and I've already either alluded to these or referred to them earlier. The first of all is to come up with some systematic set of, if you will, objectives that environmental assessment in law and policy is supposed to achieve. What do we actually want from this instrument? How will it, in fact, be applied against the existing policy frameworks we have? The second set are to come up with, I think, a good set of principles that, if you will, move us in the direction of sustainability. Clearly, the precautionary principle. Clearly, intelligent use of the mitigation hierarchy from try to achieve maximum positive benefits to avoid worst case scenarios where you're having significant effects that drop below some threshold. You'll need, as part of that, a set of criteria that identify the boundaries of what is unacceptable, certainly, and how you're actually going to, rules of thumb for how you're actually going to identify significance and evaluate significance against those boundaries, against those criteria. So I think that the idea of building in objectives and principles that will guide the process, the procedures that are to be followed, and by and large we'll be simply following the tried and true process. But it's really the way that process is applied within a governance regime that is critical, I think, for really getting at the issue of a sustainability framework. And that's where you need to have as much explicit, if you will, direction as possible. All kinds of criteria. The other, I think, major issue is how you're going to situate an environmental assessment or an environmental sustainability assessment, a sustainability assessment, within the context, if you will, of ecological change. And that can be simply taking natural capital assets as a baseline, if you will, of identification. It may involve taking some of the very exciting concepts of resilience and vulnerability in terms of an ecosystem level, in terms of how you're making these evaluations. So the more you set it in a regional context, the better off you are to be able to come to grips with the cumulative change. And that, to me, has been the Achilles heel, whether it's a sustainability assessment or an environmental assessment of EIA in the past. It very much is a problem of scope and boundaries. But unless we can identify how this proposal or course of action is going to fit in with all the others that are taking place within some defined regional, spatial, or ecological context, we're not really going to make a very good fist of getting hold of the significance of what's likely to happen.
All right, excellent. Thank you so much, Barry. And for those who are watching us, if you want to know more about sustainability assessment, trade-off evaluations, you should definitely read Barry's latest book on sustainability appraisal, published by EarthScan. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you again in the next interview.